Hello, everybody. Welcome to EUphoria and to the TTRPGirls event. We are celebrating women, femmes, and those who identify with the intersections of womanhood all across the TTRPG scene, all throughout this month. And today we have something very exciting. We have an interview which goes a little bit beyond the TTRPG hobby and into the wider role playing world. And I am joined by the fantastic, the brilliant Rho Chung. Hi,
Hi.
Ro.
Hi.
Ro, could you just introduce yourself quickly for our lovely audience?
Yes. Hello. I'm Ro. My pronouns are they, them. Um, I LARP as a hobby, and I also write for the theater section at a local magazine in Scotland called The Skinny. And in my professional life, I'm an academic working on theater and gender and violence, which we'll get into, I'm sure.
Thank you so much. Could you also give a quick visual description for anyone who's not able to see you well?
Sure. Um, it's the testo gel that's got me tripped up. Um, so I'm in my early to mid 30s, uh, light skinned person with short black hair with a little silver streak and a black turtleneck.
Beautiful. And for any of you lovely people out there who haven't met me before, I am Michelle Kelly. My pronouns are she, her. I am a mixed race woman with brown skin and long, straight black hair. And I'm a member of staff here at EUphoria. And that's very exciting because it means I get to chat to cool people. So let's get into it. We're going to be talking about LARPing today, a hobby which maybe some of our TTRPG friends have dipped their toes into. Maybe some of us have never gone onto that side of role playing world. So, Ro, can you tell us a bit about your relationship and
Mhm.
history to LARP?
Yeah, absolutely. I have kind of an untraditional relationship with LARP, especially as it's like now in the cultural imagination. I
Mhm.
think the first time people in my life started talking to me about LARP who weren't in LARP or gaming was after it appeared on What We Do in the Shadows, the TV show. Everyone was like,
Yes.
"Whoa, I saw something about LARPing. You LARP," and um, so since then, LARP in the cultural imagination has been like this specific type of LARPing. When in reality, LARPing is like really, really vast, really nebulous and vague. Any kind of live action role play, by definition, is a LARP. So my relationship to it is mostly theatrical. I got brought into it by theater people, but there's a whole mix of people. And um, I do what's mostly called parlor LARPing, which is a really, really specific and um, unprofessionalized style. So there are LARPs that you can like pay lots of money, especially in continental Europe. You can go like spend a week on a tall ship and bring lots
Ooh.
of beautiful furs and dresses, and pay lots and lots of money and make lots of beautiful friends. And I would love to do that, but my friends and I don't have that kind of time or money. And so for people who don't, you know, LARPing might seem like your only option is to do boffer LARPing, which is the one where you go into the woods and beat each other with sticks, which
Hmm.
I also love. Let me be very clear, but in parlor LARPing, it really is this kind of like organic, almost anarchic style where you're just a friend group who like decides that you want to play games and then you write games for each other. Um, and yeah, that's how I got involved.
I love that. I think that that image, the what we do in the shadows image of like a bunch of college students hitting each other with foam swords. Like I love that, and I'm sure that exists. To me, it feels a little bit like the cultural image of TTRPGs
Mhm.
is five university age men sitting in their basement with the DM screen playing D&D, and like 100% there are people who do that, and that's valid and it rocks if you do that. But the hobby is so much broader
Mhm.
than that. Like you can pay a lot of money to go do D&D in a castle and I'm sure it rocks, but you can also just play with your friends. And I,
Yeah.
I love that that's equally like accepted. I'm actually going to Phantom Peak, which is a sort of LARP destination in London in a couple of
Ooh,
weeks, and that'll be baby's first experience of like a professional LARP. So I'm
that
looking
sounds
forward
so
to
fun.
that.
Yeah.
So you've kind of given an into like an overview of what LARP is for anyone who kind of isn't familiar with the term. It's this very broad hobby, which it seems like the connective thing which brings it all together is that you are role playing as a character. And am I correct that when the game begins, you pretty much stay in character throughout the time span of the LARP?
It depends. It really, really depends. There are a lot of styles, so I'll just speak to like parlor LARPing and what I do just so that I stop having to give like a million qualifiers before every single
Of
answer.
course.
So in parlor LARPing, for the most part, yes. Um, excuse me. Sometimes there's a meta game,
Mhm.
and like we'll get into this down the line where we talk to each other and communicate with each other out of character, first as a safeguarding method, but also as like a mechanical method. So
Mhm.
one of the challenges that parlor LARPs face, as opposed to tabletop games, is that there's much less meta instruction,
Yes.
and there's no like time to think and discuss with your other players like, oh, what if we did it this way, what about this thing, do you have that thing. It's like real time.
Mhm.
And so from a mechanical perspective, it's very different in that, like, you only have most of the time like the like linear time that your character has. Most of the
Yes.
games happen in real time, so like a 5-hour ball is just a 5-hour ball. Like there's no like intermission where you go and scheme. Like you got to get it done in that time.
Yeah.
And so what's unique, first mechanically is bleh, sorry, let me take that back.
That's all right.
So beyond the mechanical differences, like I think the thing people bring up the most is the performance aspect
Mm.
and the play aspect. And not every LARPer quote unquote performs the way that like you and I as theater people would say.
Mhm.
So even though they're playing the game, they're saying the words the character would say, they're not necessarily worried about like giving a good performance, which I
Right.
really love. That was really liberating to me as a theater person. Was first performing for no audience, and
Mm.
like the only people that you're quote unquote performing for are your friends who are also performing. So like you are playing pretend like we did when we were children, and that is just like so liberating, and made me a lot better as an actor, which I don't do anymore, but made me a lot more confident in that, and also a lot more confident as a writer. And I started to like understand character a lot more organically, um, because you want to avoid like accidentally playing as yourself, which is sort of
Right.
a trope that we come across in RPGs all the time. It's like you don't
Mm.
want to start metagaming it in your head as yourself. Like you want to be as invested in the character as possible.
Mhm.
But because LARPing is so diverse, that doesn't always manifest in giving a quote unquote good performance. Um, People who are good at LARPing, in my mind, are really good at understanding other characters and like playing with you and co creating a story together, in a way that like I don't really get to do, even in theater.
I love that, and I think it does. I think our TTRPG loving audience will really relate to that aspect of it, especially for myself. I do a lot of actual play performing, where it really is also a performance at the same time. And I think a lot of people get very concerned about like I have to make sure my character's got a really cool character voice, and I have to like do cool monologues and quick-witted banter and all that stuff. And like that's great, and we all love to see it. But like I think the best performers are the best people who are also fun to have at your table when you're not on camera, which is the people who play around and like are fans of everyone else at the table and want to interact and play as the characters. And I love that LARP also seems to have that community aspect where it's not about being performative; it's about embodying a character.
Mhm.
That's fantastic. So we've talked a bit about like your experience of playing in LARP, but I know you also do run some LARPs as well. Can you talk about what goes into kind of being, I guess, what we would call a game master or the facilitator of a LARP?
Yeah. So in my little group, my social group where we LARP, we write the LARPs ourselves, which is quite
Mhm.
unusual.
Oh.
Very laborious and like high risk to write a LARP because you
Mm.
put all this work into it and then it'll maybe run one time for your friends and then never again. So it's like writing a play that only your friends will see. But when I think about it that way, like I really love that idea. I would love to have time to write plays that only my friends will see. I forgot the question.
I was just asking about what goes into running a
What
LARP.
goes into the, yeah, okay. I see where I was going now.
Yeah.
So there are LARPs that run frequently in this group, this sort of like, because I'm from the United States, and the group of people that I LARP with kind of spans the American Northeast
Mm,
and is comparably very, very small and linked to a lot of like larger LARP networks. But most of the games that I've played have been written by people I know, which is really unusual and really special. Um, and so when you run a game for your friends, it's like an act of love. It's an act of care. Like you are putting up a structured social space for them to come and see each other and play with each other. And maybe you wrote it yourself, maybe one of your friends wrote it. Oftentimes, like someone will play a game, and if they really love it, they'll take it and run it for their friends. And that's how
mm,
the community grows, and that's how the LARP grows. Um, so most LARPs most parlor LARPs that are, like, meant to be done, in a quote unquote "parlor" or in someone's living room are, like, 8 people or fewer, and they can be run by 1 person, which means that there's, like, a hosting element to it. So,
mm,
like, you potentially invite people into your home or your friend's home, and you put them up, you host them, you run a game for them. It becomes, like, a community act and a community event that's not just about playing the game. Um, but then within the game itself, running the game is a lot more hands off than it might be in a tabletop setting. So instead of
mm.
going like turn by turn or narrating what's happening is literally just like what's happening in space. So a lot of the time, the game master is just watching and making sure that everything that needs to happen is happening and things that shouldn't be happening aren't happening.
Yeah.
Um, so I think in a lot of ways, the game master is the only audience, and
Mm.
the only times I've ever heard any feedback at all about, like, my quote unquote "performance" in a LARP is from game masters who were, like, watching, and they were like, "Oh, I saw that scene with you in the kitchen. That was, like, really touching." And I'm like,
Aw.
"I didn't know you were watching. That's really cute."
So you're kind of a bit of a fly on the wall for
Mhm.
a lot of the LARP when you're running it, and you're only kind of making yourself known if something needs a little guiding hand in a certain direction.
Yeah. It really depends on the format.
Hmm.
Um, there's a lot of, like, items written on papers. There's like mechanical, logistical things that need to be handed out, occasional foam swords for duels, that kind of thing. But yeah, otherwise, you as a non player, you're really just watching it unfold.
That honestly sounds really lovely. Now you mentioned that a lot of people you work with are still based in North America, so I take from that that much like our friends here at EUphoria, most of your gaming is online. So that's very different from the image of running around a forest or sitting in someone's living room. How does LARPing online differ? Like, how has that changed the LARPing scene?
It's a great and very layered question for me because I moved to Scotland about 7 years ago, and I left, like, my friends behind. And I was like, well, I guess I won't get to LARP with these people unless I'm back. And you know, they've been very kind about trying to schedule in-person LARPs when I'm visiting home, which is
Oh,
amazing. But over the early stages of the pandemic, people started running more games on Discord, and
mm,
these are just text-based games. So it's like back to the 2000s in the forums, text-based role-playing where you make yourself a little character and you put your what you're going to say in quotes and you narrate what your character's doing and you move through the Discord server like it's a space and every channel is a different room. Um, and honestly, doing this has really revitalized LARP writing for me. Um, just because of the difficulty of doing it in person for me. So I just stopped playing. I stopped writing for a few years, and it wasn't until we started playing on Discord again that my friends and I started writing again. And, I'm writing one that's happening in April, and people are playing it from like 4 different time zones or whatever. And it's just a really wonderful online community. I think that it has a lot of great sort of cultural references to nerds and to geeks and to how a lot of us grew up in the early 2000s. I think I can really only speak for the people that I know, but as a very like queer and trans and neurodivergent group of people, I think a lot of us grew up feeling quite isolated from the people in person in our lives
mm,
and going out into the world. as a child didn't feel as real as being online with your friends. So it's been really, really nice to sort of have that in a way as an adult.
Yeah, I feel like showing our age here a little bit, but like it makes me think back to like being in the forums, doing your like Homestuck or like your like your role playing as a cat, you know, if you know, you know. Um, but like bringing that into a more like sort of I say adult space, grown-ups playing and in a little bit more of a structured way and
Mhm.
exploring things. I think that's so lovely. And I think something you touched on there that I definitely relate to in my experience of TTRPGs is it is a very queer space. It's a very neurodivergent space. It's a very space where a lot of marginalized people are in my world.
Yeah,
But I sometimes forget that I go to a convention and I'm like, oh, this hobby is actually really dominated by white men. And you know, I've met some white men and I think they're great. But I sometimes forget that like, oh, the hobby as a whole isn't quite as diverse as the corner of it that I've cultivated. I wonder, like, in your experience with LARP, is there as much diversity in the wider scene, or is it similar in that there's pockets of diversity, but the scene is different?
I think it's quite similar. And just speaking from my own experience, like, in the UK and in the US, it's like you say, like friend groups will do it together, and those friend groups can be quite diverse. But at like the quote unquote national level or the convention level, there are still a lot of initiatives to bring, in particular, Black LARPers into it, um,
Mm,
and like economically disadvantaged LARPers, working class LARPers. Um, and those movements are still present, which suggests that those problems are still present. But yeah, it was not a surprise to me when I started, but because the group that I did it with first was so predominantly like femme and artistic and like alt sort of non-normative, when they eventually said to me, they were like, well, the reason there are so few women's roles in all of these larps is because there are just no women in larping groups. So the
mm.
larps that people wrote early on in this group were tailored to a community that reflected something that was no longer reflected, and over time that's changed. And like when you write a larp for your friend group, you kind of precast it in your head,
Yeah.
and you kind of like write characters with specific people in mind, and so that changed organically over time. But it was interesting that for a little bit there was a mismatch between the material and the group because the material was created by this normative environment.
That is really fascinating, especially as you're saying in LARPs that maybe it's more common to have like a character list that you're picking from rather than generating your own. So I can see how maybe that would be potentially risk being a little bit unwelcoming
Mhm,
to more gender diversity specifically. I'm thinking like femmes coming into that space and being there's no characters for me to play here. But I do think as well that embodying a character can be such an interesting way to explore your identity.
mhm.
Um, and I wonder, like, has as that has changed, as people are starting to write more diverse LARPs, are you seeing people using that space of role playing as a chance to like explore their own gender identity?
Absolutely. I think, like, to me, when I was younger, LARPing was definitely therapy. And whether or not that was like healthy or advisable, it's in the past. But um, I I have seen writers like really ask questions with their LARPs and like pose questions to the friend group through
Mm,
their writing in a really fascinating way, especially about race. In a space that is still so predominantly white, despite all of its other intersectional diversities. Um, I think that the writers that I've played games from have asked really interesting questions about like how race is constructed and how or like what we owe to our black and brown friends like in this space. Um, and it doesn't even have to be that heavy-handed, and it also raises an ongoing question that I'm sure you've come across in RPG spaces of like whether it's appropriate, like what it's appropriate to do as a white
mm.
writer or a white player. Um, but I think the nice thing about us not looking to turn LARP into money in any way, like no one's looking to go pro or use this as a launch pad for anything else, is that, like, it is a safe space to ask those questions and to
Mm,
just, like, sometimes put something into the air and just let it be there. We don't
mhm,
have to solve it right away. It's, part of our obligation as people to, like, continue working through it. Um, but, there are no stakeholders who are gonna be mad at us if we don't meet certain requirements or if our LARPs don't look a certain way.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, it can be alienating, especially, like, when I was younger and I was, like, a white and Asian queer femme in their early 20s. That's quite a vulnerable position to be in an RPG space.
Yeah.
Um, and it's a confusing experience because you get a lot of attention. Uh,
Mm.
I think a lot of nerds who have been hot ladies in their 20s can attest to this.
I'm a hot lady now, but probably in my 20s I was
Remained
okay.
hot ladies, yeah. Some of us are T-boys now, but yeah,
You can still be a hot lady on weekends if the mood takes you, Ro.
so true, and I do. It does. But yeah, I feel like, especially if you're an actor and you come to it through theater,
Mm,
being in a LARP feels like being in a play where everyone is the main character, and
mm,
it feels so good to be cast in something and, like, to feel like the GM has put thought into how you and the role are similar and different and, like, what you can do with the role,
mm,
that sometimes you're being siloed and you don't even notice, because sometimes, like, fetishization can, like, feel like fame. It feels like popularity, it feels like love, um, and this is not to say that, like, the friends that I LARP with treated me that way, but I think that, like, the medium certainly treats people that way, and, like, the the culture around quote unquote "geek things"
mm.
certainly treats people that way. Um, so as a young woman, you come into the space with a certain type of cultural capital, and also with certain disadvantages. And it's been really interesting, as we've all gotten older and sort of like become ourselves, parentheses, transitioned. It's been interesting to confront that retrospectively.
I can imagine. I think it's really interesting picking up specifically as we're both like POCs,
Mhm,
um, kind of that dual experience of feeling very, very, very visible in certain spaces while also feeling a bit erased and a
mhm,
bit invisible. Like everyone's looking at me, but no one's hearing me is
mhm,
definitely something that I've felt personally. And I know that other POCs, like in role playing hobbies, have felt. It's really interesting. I think that you've also felt that in the LARPing space. And in a way it's sad to hear that, but it's also a little bit kind of okay, we share these experiences across all sorts of quote unquote geek hobbies which have been seen to look a certain way. You walk into that space, you don't look that certain way. And you have to kind of not just through your character, but in yourself, be like, how will I project myself into this space? How will I take space in this environment where I'm sort of being treated as a little novelty, I
mhm,
suppose. And I think part of that is building communities like we do here. We're really passionate about having lots of POCs on the channel and showing like, yeah, we're actually playing these games and we're not that hard to find. We want to be involved. Hi. But also at the same time, like not trying to treat it as so special,
mhm.
not trying to treat it as notable because it shouldn't be. Do you find in the LARP world you're building these kinds of communities where marginalized folks are both held with safety, but also kind of trying to show like, hey, we're doing this and don't treat us as novelty?
Mm. I've been, like, kind of distant from the, like, larger LARPing landscape, but I know
Mm,
that there are those spaces out there. Um, for myself, in the group that I do it with, the best, like, defense against those feelings has been, um, friendship. And, honestly, I think the nice thing about playing with your friends and like really emphasizing the social aspect of it is that like your care for each other spans beyond the LARP and beyond the like space of the game. Um, and so as I got to know people and people got to know me over time, I started to feel less gazed at
Mm,
because I was finding a social role in the community. Um, but as far as like enacting that in larger LARP spaces, like a convention where you don't know everybody and you don't have time to like get to know every single person that you're playing with. Um, I think that those social connections still play a big role because it's like it's so vital for white players, for example, to advocate for players of color, and not in like a protective or a saviory way,
mm,
but that space needs to be held, and white players have the ability to like push back against any kind of harmful practices. But I think, like you say, showing that it's actually not that special that we play these games, and it's
yeah.
like we would simply like to play without like ending up on Tumblr or like in some like not I don't want to get papped and end up on Tumblr. That's
Can you think of a worse fate than ending up on Tumblr?
no.
On that bombshell, let's go to a quick break so we can process our feelings about Tumblr as millennials. Let's get some water and we'll be back very shortly, friends.
BRB.
Hello again, friends. So, we've talked about race, we've ticked that off, we've solved race. I now want to talk a bit about gender. This is, of course, TTRP Girls Month. And I want to talk a bit more about that and particularly about your background, Ro, as an academic whose research interests kind of fall into theatrical conventions regarding gender dynamics. And I know you've also worked a lot on gendered violence in classical theatre. I know that LARP takes its roots, at least somewhat, from theatre. And I wonder, like, do you see those theatrical conventions showing up in the LARP space? Like, can you talk a bit about your experience there?
Mhm. Absolutely. So a very quick whistle stop tour on like what all of those terms mean to my work.
Mm.
Um, so my thesis was titled Shakespeare Without Men, Gendered Violence and Genderqueer Shakespeare. And I looked at several productions that were at the time billed as all female casts. Now, I don't really use that word necessarily to refer to them because there are people in those casts who are trans, who are non binary, and also because you can't tell what someone's situation is by looking at them. And I wanted to give the performers as much privacy as I could while writing an 80,000 word thesis about them. So, what really interests me about performance is like, first, the way that gender is constructed on stage. We take signs from the stage, things like the type of body a performer has, the type of voice, the way that they're styled, the way that they move and speak, their actions on stage. And we interpolate that data and fill in the blanks, and that's what telling a story is taking signs and turning them into information at its most basic level. And one of the things that came up in my thesis, and something that, it has a very long history in English and philosophy and all of that, is that gender itself is constructed by these signs. So when we're looking at a genderqueer cast of all non-men, um, that sign system is disrupted, and the audience is asked to suspend what we've been told a man is, for example. Um, and that suspension of disbelief that we talk about with theater plays into gender as well. And the relationship between the way gender is performed on stage and the way gender is performed off stage in the real world, um, comes up a lot in like really big philosophers like Judith Butler, all of those guys. But for me, as it relates to LARP, I think that it has a really interesting function First, because so many people that I LARP with are trans.
Mm,
And second, because, so many LARPs, are related to fantasy and like the overarching idea of LARP and RPG and D&D is that it's sort of fantasy adjacent.
mm,
Now, you and I both know that that's like just a tiny, tiny fraction of the games that are out there, but I do think that the conventions of the fantasy genre carry over into a lot of games, and those conventions um, are quite gendered. And we look at like sources of fantasy literature. The genders quite and race as well are both very prescriptive in those like world building modes. I'm
mm.
running out of academic words here, but um basically LARP transed me. And not only did LARP trans me, but like I became myself through LARP and LARPing, not even LARPing like quote unquote as masks or like not as women, but performing femininity in a LARP setting helped me understand my relationship to it,
Mm,
especially in these characters. Like it always comes up for me in every game, like something horrible and sad is going to happen to me. I'm sure you and I could talk about that single thing for 100 years, but we'll just leave it there. Some horrible and sad thing is going to happen to the most femme person in the game. And I really had to unpack like my relationship with the performance of my gender and trauma and the way that I felt traumatized by successfully portraying a woman my whole life,
mm,
if that makes sense. And it really helped me unpick the feelings of reward that you get for successfully being a girl from the feelings of dysphoria that that gave me. And I got to unpick that in a safe place, in an environment where it's okay to take a break and it's okay to get upset and it's okay to talk about it after. And it's also okay never to talk about it again.
mm,
Um, I think when these sorts of discoveries and these sorts of emotional processes, like grieving the gender that you thought you had, are hidden behind layers of play. Like I'm in a game playing some like magical elf princess who's been traded in a blood pact, and it's so sad. And because there's so much fiction happening there, it was so much easier for me to treat it like drag and to understand my femininity as a kind of drag, which like I still love to do. Like you say, I love to back pass. I love to style myself and like put myself in little costumes. Um, and like LARPing gave that to me in a way, gave that back to me. Um, and over like the years that I've done it, actually the types of characters that I play haven't changed that much. Like I still really like playing the most femme person that something really sad happens to, but my relationship to it is different and I feel so much less traumatized by it now. And um I feel like deeply connected with that part of myself in a much healthier way.
That is so interesting, and thank you for sharing like such a personal experience of like exploring gender through role play. I think that's really beautiful. I think there's something so powerful about the constructed reality
Mm,
of of role playing games, be that LARP, be that TTRPG, that in a theater space there are you've got directors and writers and theaters, like you've got outside bodies projecting what that reality looks like, but in a role playing space, you who are all on the same level are constructing it together. Yes, there might be a game master, but as you said, it's a very collaborative process. And I think that builds such a place of safety to be like, okay, maybe I almost always play girl characters who use she her pronouns, but sometimes I don't. And it's such an interesting question for me, like if I'm playing a he him, a they them, a person who uses different pronouns from my own, how do I portray that? I'm thinking about the signals you said. How do I change my performance to indicate that I'm playing a different gender. And what does that mean if I decide, like, oh, I'm playing a male character, so I've got to tie my hair back and have short hair? Like, what am I talking about? Of course, in real life, I don't expect like men to have short hair, and yet when I'm playing one on TV, I'm
Yeah.
I'm changing the way I present. I think
Mhm,
it's such a fascinating space to play with those ideas of how do we perform gender,
mhm.
and then to take it back into our real worlds in our own time and in our own space and say, how am I performing gender all the time? And why do I feel comfortable performing gender in one space but not another? I think that's so fascinating. But I think that it also, you talked a lot as well about the sad thing. The saddest thing is always going to happen to the most femme, which again, like that could be a whole other thesis there.
Yeah, it's coming.
The roots of theatre loom large over the way we tell stories, for sure.
Yes.
But there can be some really dark subject matter, and
Mhm,
even if there's not dark subject matter, doing all that kind of internal exploration through a game by your own choice can be challenging.
mhm,
In the TTRPG world, especially in the actual play world, we're really trying to push for standardized safety tools to keep everyone in a place where they can play without causing themselves harm unexpectedly. What kind of safety procedures are in place in your LARP communities to do similar things?
mhm. So the most common rules that like I'm not playing a LARP if this isn't there is the like out of character signaling. So
Mhm.
there's always a like an agreed upon hand signal to mean like I'm saying this out of character. It'll be like this or something. Um and especially when people are new, we use this really, really liberally. Um, so like earlier I said, like there's no metagaming, you don't have time to talk to your fellow players. That's not strictly true. Um, you as a player always have the right to stop the action and ask a question or say something. And beyond that, we use the words cut and break.
Mm.
Um, break being like, I'm okay with this where it is now, but I don't want it to escalate at all. And cut being emergency stop, everybody stops and we calm down and figure out what's going on. Um, and those are so, so helpful. And again, like I'm not playing a LARP if we're not doing those things. And it's always developing, if like we start playing with someone who needs something else, it's super easy to implement that because we're just guys in someone's living room. So,
Mhm.
like, why wouldn't we go as far as we possibly can to make people feel safe and to make people actually safe? Um, there's also this is kind of a different answer. Like there's like a mechanical answer. Like we literally have these hand signals. We have a quiet room that's designated non-play, so you're out of character when you're in that room. But on a broader level, um, like we are very much accountable to each other because we have these social connections. So it's not necessarily like a paid LARP where you show up and it's strangers. And
Mm.
if something happens, like that's shitty, but you're never going to see these people again. Oh, sorry, I swore.
That's okay. We swear on this channel. It's all right.
Oh my
I won't.
God,
I won't. I won't
so
tell on you.
cool. Don't tell on me. Um, But when you're LARPing with a friend group or doing anything with a friend group, you would hope that there's some sort of social accountability there.
Mm.
Um, and there has been for me, like anytime anything happens where something's uncomfortable, it's dealt with immediately or even like proactively. Like, I think something that I really praise about this group a lot is that they, for example, don't allow certain like they just don't allow certain things. Like there can be a huge age gap between like young people joining the group and people who've been in it for a while. And I think that the community that I came up in particular is quite mindful of power dynamics.
Mm.
Um and especially mindful of how vulnerable a young woman can be coming into that space. Um and every friend group is going to navigate things differently and come up against obstacles differently. But I think that there is this sort of like organic structure in the group that there's like an unspoken understanding that we will go out of our way for each other.
Hmm.
And that's so powerful.
Absolutely. I think that's really wonderful, especially what you say about when we have a social connection, we actually, in a way, almost have more responsibility to take care of each other's safety. Speaking from personal experience, I only came across TTRPG safety tools when I was playing online with strangers. And I was like, oh, I've never done any of this when I'm around the table with my friends. And I think it's because we have this assumption, oh, we all know each other. We know what our boundaries are. We'll just say if something's not cool. And I'm like, actually, the fact we know each other and we have to continue to interact and we can't just leave this behind and never think of it again is why we should be formalizing some kind of safety. And what that might look like might be different for each
Yeah.
individual group of friends. It might not be as standardized. But I think it's so valuable to have something and be like, let's agree on what we're actually actively doing and not assuming that we know each other and that's enough.
Yeah.
Um, Especially because, as you say, like, it can be vulnerable for a new person to come into a group with more experienced role players. It can be vulnerable to come into a group when you've maybe been going through it in your personal life, and maybe something's going to come up which previously you would have loved to have played with that in the story, but today I don't want to deal with XYZ topic coming up, and there needs to be a way to make sure that everyone's okay
Yeah.
with doing that. I am very gratified to hear that, like, LARPers are taking this kind of thing seriously. I think that from my perspective in the TTRPG world, it's going in the correct direction. More and more people are becoming aware of things like the lines and veils tool, which is a veil is something which it can exist, but we're not going to dwell on it. And a line, we're not bringing it up. No, there's the X card tool, which is kind of sounds like your break, where you're just like, we stop, let's
Mhm.
sort this out. And I just think all of those things are so valuable to talk about and to model in our role playing spaces, because that's a great way to make it more accessible and to keep diversifying what we're doing. Ro, this has been so fascinating. I feel like I could talk to you about LARP forever, and I probably will. But for the sake of this interview not lasting until the end of time, I'd love to ask you one final question, which is if our beautiful audience out there in the EUphoria world have been listening to this and thinking, I want to try LARPing, I want to have a go, do you have any tips for them of how they can find communities, how they can keep themselves safe, or any other beginner LARPer tips to share?
I do. You have two
Mhm.
options. First, you can do a paid LARP. Um, I'll never say like, don't do paid LARPs. They're all terrible. I think that they sound really fun. And if I had money, I would love to do them. But yeah. So, first option, go to a paid LARP, make friends, meet people. LARPers are really, really friendly in my experience, extremely willing to trade info and invite you to things. Um, but if you have a group of friends that you like love to do group things with and they're all super willing and super adventurous, just write a LARP and play it. Or you can buy LARPs online. Um, a lot of independent creators have little websites where you can buy a PDF and it gives you all of the game documents and all of the character sheets, and you can run it in your own house. Um, I think that especially if you're a first time LARPer, turning it into a social event where you can kind of laugh about it and figure it out together, and you're not in front of strangers and it's not something that you've paid for and therefore feel you need to get value out of. I think that's really liberating. So I know that it's vague and I know that it's kind of like saying my advice is to get friends, but um, my advice is to look for some independent LARPs to download and um, grab some friends on a weekend night and ambush them with the activity and tell them that they have to do it, and you'll be really, really upset if they don't.
Impose LARP upon your friends and associates.
Yes.
That could be attributed to Rho Chung as
Mhm.
solid advice. You know what? Because you're here watching on Euphoria, you do have friends who love gaming and role playing. We have our Euphoria Discord. Hop on in and join the Looking for Group channel and say, did you all watch that great interview? Anyone want to try LARPing through? We'll set up a Discord server for it. We'd love that. You have friends, you can do it online. We all have friends here because we're all a community here. Thank you so much, Ro, for lending your insights. It's been
Thank
so
you.
interesting to discuss this other aspect of role playing gaming outside of the tabletop world, but has so many links and commonalities. It's made me want to do some more LARPing. Maybe I'll give it a go.
Yeah,
Hey.
maybe you'll turn up at my door with a LARP.
I do know where you live, so there's a non-zero possibility that I
It's
will
like
show up and be like, it's LARPing time, baby, let's go.
a pretty high possibility, actually.
What are you doing next week? We'll do that. We'll do that off camera. I'm coming up to Scotland right now.
Mhm.
Um, so just to sign off, can you once again remind all of our lovely audience who you are and if you wish to be perceived, where they can find you online?
I have been Rho Chung, and I will continue to be Rho Chung. And if you want to find me on Instagram, I'm on there as Rho Jogan. It'll be in the text information, I believe. And if you want to read more of my writing, you can find me on the Skinny in the theater section and sometimes music.
I highly recommend reading Rose writing. They always have fabulously insightful things to say, as you have just seen. I have been and continue to be Michelle Kelly. You know where to find me. It's at Euphoria, but I'm also at Michelle Helicopter on the socials. And you just can't get rid of me. I'll be showing up whenever there's TTRPGs to be had. Thank you all so much for joining us. Make sure you catch all the other brilliant programming here on TTRP Girls Month at Euphoria. We're on all the socials. And while you're here, if you haven't already followed Euphoria on Twitch, maybe even subscribed, you can do that. You can catch us over on YouTube and subscribe to us there. You can even join the Patreon, where we have all sorts of exciting behind the scenes content, and you will be financially supporting this channel. Because guess what? Running a channel like this isn't free. It costs us money. Help us keep it going because we love it. Thank you all for joining us. We love you very much and have a lovely rest of your day.